mute myself.
There we go.
Meeting is being recorded. Got it. Right.
Okay, so nobody knows much about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
No.
So anything. Well, it was in 1962, and it's generally agreed that that was the time when the world came closest to nuclear war.
Oh my God. I can't believe I didn't know about this.
Oh, you don't know. And for many years after it was, the consensus was that just close that, I can't read the thing. It was the consensus of what happened and why it happened and how it ended was the same for many years until after the fall of the USSR and some declassified American governmental papers gave a different sort of story. So, as usual, we have to go back in time, but I'll skip through this. Cuba was in the 19th century under Spanish rule. It was a Spanish colony. And in the 19th century, there was various uprisings. There was the black slaves who called the Year of the Lash. There was a Cuban independence war. There's different pacts and moves to try and end slavery in the 10 Years' War. The second uprising, finally slavery was abolished, and then in 1895 an actual Cuban revolution was relaunched, and in 1898 the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and that was one of the contributing factors to the declaration of war by the United States on Spain. Now, it's still not clear who actually blew up the USS Maine. There's different theories about that. But what happened is the United States invaded Cuba to ensure that their independence, and Spain relinquished sovereignty, and the US became the government of Cuba, took over the government of Cuba and put in a provisional governor. Then in the 20th century, there was the Platt Amendment. Now, this amendment was forced on the Cubans, and it basically said that if the Americans have any reason to feel threatened or by events on Cuba, they are able to invade and put things right. So when the Cuban Republic was established a year later, that amendment was in the Constitution. And they also signed confirming the lease of Guantanamo Bay, which the United States still own. And then in 1906, the US decided that they needed to intervene and occupy. They stayed for 3 years. Then in the next big event was 1933, Sergeant Revolt, which was basically the army, enlisted men and student activists who overthrew the government at the time. But it wasn't what they put in place wasn't recognized by the United States until the president, who the United States didn't like, was forced to resign. And then the US recognized the new government. In 1940, the Constitution was implemented, and it was one of the most progressive constitutions at the time: land reform, public education, minimum wage, and other social programs. And then Batista, who had been one of the sergeants and had made himself the head of the armed forces, actually ran for president, and he succeeded. So he was president for 4 years and then decided he was going to live in the USA. In 1952, he decides he wants to become president again, but it looks like he's going to not do well in the election. So he uses his army contacts and leads a military coup before the election is due to take part, and the United States recognizes government. And then from 52 to 59, Cuba is a playground for the American elite. If you've seen Godfather 2, there's a good section of it about Cuba. It's basically run by the mafia, and Batista gets a share in everything, so he's quite happy to let it carry on. And at the same time, the Cuban economy is just dominated by American financial interests. As you can see there, 90% of mines, 80% of public utilities, etc., etc. Then in 1953, a small group of revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago. One of these people, one of the leaders, was Fidel Castro. It was a bit of a farce and they were easily defeated. And Castro ended up in exile in Mexico. And then him and his brother Raul were introduced to Che Guevara, and they began getting together a group which eventually set out for Cuba with 82 men. That was the start. That's how they started off, with just 82 people. They continued a guerrilla war throughout 57, 58, and the discontent was growing in Cuba. There was a general strike and things like that. Workers and peasants were supporting the guerrillas, and in the end, in 1959, Batista is forced to resign, flees the country, and Castro is sworn in as prime minister. So in 1959, in April, the first place he goes to visit as prime minister is the United States, and he's actually met with very positive approval because he's overthrown Batista, and a lot of Americans think, you know, this is a good guy and everything. But President Eisenhower, for his own reasons, refuses to meet him, and he sends Vice President Richard Tricky Dicky Nixon, and Castro instantly takes a dislike to Nixon, which apparently isn't very difficult. When he gets back to Cuba, the reforms start. There's an agrarian reform where all the large holdings are seized, and these are mostly belong to foreign businesses or corporations. There's redistribution to smaller landowners, and then social reforms in education, free healthcare, etc. And start building new roads and improving the infrastructure, which has just been left to, you know, deteriorate. Then in 1960, a Belgian ship with a French crew, which is taking arms, military arms to Cuba, explodes in Havana Harbor. That's the sabotage of La Cubra. There's 100 deaths, including 6 of the French crew, and 200 plus injured, and many bodies are never found. Now, the ship owners said it was just an accident, and so did the US government. The Cubans do an investigation, and they blame the US. And the bodyguard of one of the Cubans says he saw a dock worker go on board with a package that was a package of dynamite, and he claims the one who did it. So nobody, to this day, nobody actually knows, but it was definitely an explosion within the ship and not, as first thought, mishandling of goods when they were on the dock. The other names in the frame, as it were of course the CIA could have done it, or what's called the Main Rouge, which was a clandestine cell in the French Ministry of the Interior, who had their own reasons to try and blow it up, because Cuba was actually supporting Algerian independence. So from May 1959, the CIA had supervised bombings, raids and arming of opposition groups in Cuba. It was then that Eisenhower approved the CIA plan to invade, and the CIA were able to work with the mafia, and their plan was to assassinate Cuban leaders, especially Castro, of course. And then the United States actually started exerting pressure on other countries not to sell any weapons to Cuba, which meant in the end that Cuba, the only place Cuba could turn to in the end was the Soviet Union. And that was the intention of the United States, to push them into that relationship. Then in 1961, President Kennedy and his brother Robert initiated Operation Mongoose. Operation Mongoose was basically, it included dirty tricks like false flag things like blowing something up and blaming the Cubans, or just anything that they could blame the Cubans for, but the CIA were taking action. There was actions against the civilian population, economic terrorism, and of course, carry on with the assassinations. It's reckoned that in 1962 alone, there was 5,000 acts of sabotage or terrorism in Cuba. And in August 62, President Kennedy issued the National Security Action Memorandum, which basically was to engineer an internal revolt and then military intervention in Cuba. So then one of the results of this was the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was actually approved by Eisenhower, but Kennedy also approved it, but it turned out to be a completely disaster. There was an airstrike by B-26 bombers, which were actually flown by Cuban exiles, but they were American bombers with the identification changed on them. And then 1,500 of these Cuban exiles, who were trained and financed by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs. Castro, though, and his militia were mobilized, and they soon had outnumbered them. And just a couple of days later, the invaders missed an eye out there. Anyway, they were defeated. 100 plus were killed and 1,200 captured, and then later released, but for, as it says there, $53 million worth of baby food and medicine, which seems a good deal. Then the crisis. On the 14th of July, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, approved the secret deployment of nuclear missiles on Cuba. They were actually first deployed on the 8th of September. And on the 14th of October, the Americans suspected something was going on, but there was confirmation from a U-2 spy plane of the missiles' presence, or at least the means to the means to fire them. And then on the 16th, President Kennedy is informed of the missile's presence. Now, this was the widely accepted account for many, many years from when it finished to right up to 1990s or so. So President Kennedy is briefed on the 16th of October. Then he immediately calls together a group of advisors, the brains of American politics and the military. And they become known as EXCOM, short for Executive Committee. And so for the next 2 weeks of the crisis, this is what the group that wrestled with what to do about the crisis. For the Americans, they said the urgency was the fact that nuclear-armed Cuban missiles were being installed just 90 miles from the American mainland, and they were capable of reaching targets in eastern USA. And they said that if they became operational, the missiles would fundamentally alter the complexion of the nuclear rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. It was said that in the EXCOM, there was hawks and doves. The doves were the ones who wanted to negotiate, and the hawks wanted to bomb or invade. 4 options were on the table. One was negotiation, then there was bombing attack on the missile sites, full-scale invasion, and the 4th was a quarantine to prevent the Soviets from delivering any more missiles or military equipment. It was called a quarantine. What it was actually was a blockade, but if they'd called it a blockade, then that would, in international law, be a declaration of war on the Soviet Union. So they didn't want that, so they just changed the name of it, basically. Then Kennedy goes on TV and explains to the nation, 7 o'clock prime time, his decision to enact a quarantine. And he makes it clear that the US was prepared to use military force if necessary. Then, according to the story, Kennedy decides to give the Soviet leader more time to consider the US action by pulling the quarantine back to 500 miles from Cuba. Soviet ships were bound for Cuba, and they were nearing the line of the US vessels. They stopped just short of the blockade. And the famous quote is from Dean Russ: "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fella just blinked. Then the Soviets agreed to remove the missile, and Kennedy made an insurance not to invade Cuba, even though he said we never intended to anyway. So it's easy to say which. And then this event ever since has been portrayed as due to the president's tough stance and his holding his nerve and skilled diplomacy in the face of Soviet aggression. So that was the story that was around for 30 years after the 30 odd years after the crisis actually took place. You know what I'm going to say next is that there is an alternative to this. The first thing we need to look at is the US presidential election. When Kennedy became US president, the election was actually the closest run of the 20th century. Kennedy wasn't as popular then as he did become after his death. And one of his main planks of his election was what he called the missile gap, and the American response to Cuba by Nixon and the Eisenhower administration. The missile gap was basically that the Russians had overwhelming superiority in nuclear missiles, and they could destroy America at any point. And then 2 years later, there was the midterm elections. His popularity was falling, and he couldn't get any of his legislation through because the Southern Democrats, who were very conservative, voted with the Republicans, blocking any of Kennedy's programs, especially anything to do with race relations. And the Democrats were predicted to lose a lot of seats in the midterm elections. Right, the missile gap. This idea, it was actually promoted by the US government and military, and this is what most of the population of America thought at the time, that the USSR had overwhelming superiority in numbers and quality of ICBM, which is intercontinental missiles. So the public thought that the USA had 100 and the USSR 500. In actual fact, the USA had 170 and the USSR had between 4 and 12. So there's a hell of a difference. And also the Soviet missiles were far less sophisticated and far less accurate than the American ones. So why did Khrushchev decide to put missiles on Cuba? Well, Castro was asking for Russian troops and arms to counter what he saw as the American threat to invade. The Soviets promised support, but they gave very little, and most of it failed to materialize. So Castro started to look elsewhere, and the Russians were actually, they were worried that we would start to look towards China, because Chairman Mao was heavily critical of the Soviets' approach to Cuba. Then there was the planned invasion from the United States, which was supposed to take place in October. They found out about that because they started doing test runs in a nearby Caribbean island. Khrushchev thought the missiles would not upset the nuclear balance. And because there was many missiles in Italy and Turkey aimed straight at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't have any comparable missiles. And the other thing that Khrushchev was thinking is that they couldn't keep up with the Americans on building missiles, and that he wanted to do a cheaper option, as it were. And he also thought it was like throwing a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, because quite weird turns of phrase, did Khrushchev. But he liked to say things like that. So he kept it secret, and the reason is he thought the midterm elections would make the Americans jumpy. As there's a quote there from him about traditions in the United States that they do weird things when there's elections on. He was going to announce their existence in November. And his idea was to say, we've got these missiles, that's tough, they're hairs, and what are you going to do about it? His idea, Khrushchev, was if the Americans objected, he would then say, do a swap. Well, you take your missiles out of Turkey and possibly Italy, and then the other thing is we'll talk about the future of West Berlin, which was, if anybody knows, Berlin was divided after the war into east and west, but Berlin was actually far inside East Germany. So, did the missiles fundamentally alter the nuclear balance of power? This is a quote from Robert McNamara after the crisis years later. And as you can see, he says, on the Tuesday morning, we learned of the missiles. And he said, I didn't believe the missile deployment underway in Cuba changed the nuclear balance between the Soviet Union and the United States, not one bit. it was absurd to believe that the missiles in Cuba affected the global nuclear balance, because the Americans knew that they had the superiority over the Russians. The public didn't know, but the government did through spy planes, etc. And they knew that there was no chance of the Soviets actually firing the first missile, because the American response would just basically wipe them out. So the Executive Committee of National Security Council, EXCOM, is formed. What they didn't know, and what nobody knew till afterwards, is that the Kennedys had actually installed microphones all over the White House so they could record everything that happened. Adlai Stevenson, who was the United States UN representative, got in touch with Kennedy straight away and said, why don't we just bargain the missiles on Cuba for the NATO missiles in Turkey, which were actually becoming obsolescent because they were starting to put nuclear missiles on submarines, Polaris missiles they were called. And the ones, they'd only been there a year in Turkey, but they were already out of date. But the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, was the main proponent for bombing and even a nuclear strike against the USSR. He was definitely on the hawk side of things. So at the first meeting, what the actual options were do nothing. They could have done nothing. Like Matt Manara said, they didn't alter the balance of nuclear power, and that was an option. They could exert diplomatic pressure. They could have an air attack, full military invasion, or the quarantine. But at the first meeting, they said America's priority was to show the world they couldn't be bullied. And the other thing that was a factor was that Kennedy had spent the last few years attacking the previous administration for being soft on Cuba and not standing up to the Russians or the Cubans, and so he was a bit in a bit of a bind, because he'd spent, he couldn't really turn around and start negotiating, because the opposition, the Republicans, would start accusing him of the same thing. Then after the meeting, Kennedy was talking to his brother Bobby, and he's really angry. He starts calling Khrushchev names, and he goes on about his deceit and everything. And the deceit he's talking about is that Khrushchev had previously indicated to Kennedy that he wouldn't cause any upsets before the forthcoming elections. He would sort of calm things down until that was all over. And Kennedy was angry that he'd actually caused a crisis before the elections. So Thursday, October the 18th, Kennedy meets Gromyko, who is the Foreign Secretary of the Soviet Union. By that time, Kennedy had pictures of the missiles, photographic evidence in the drawer in his desk in the White House. He asked Gromyko if there was any offensive weapons on Cuba, and Gromyko said all the weapons are defensive. Now, at this point, Kennedy could have pulled out the photographs and said, well, what are these? And started some sort of negotiation period. But he didn't. He just left them where he was. And that was the end of the meeting. Saturday, October the 20th is an EXCOM meeting. The majority of them want to bomb and invade Cuba. That's the majority opinion. Kennedy doesn't want to, and he's arguing for the quarantine. And in the end, they do agree that the quarantine would be the first step. And the agreement is, if that fails, then they invade Cuba. And then that's when Kennedy goes on national TV on the Monday night and lets the American public, or in this case, the American voters, know what's going on, or his version of what's going on. He then informs the US allies what he's doing. And his allies actually are not very impressed, because as the British Prime Minister at the time, Macmillan, said, we've had missiles pointed to us at us for years. What's the big deal, basically? You know, we've got missiles just across the border and we're a target. And the other countries would sort of say, why don't you just negotiate? You know, the Italians get in touch and say, look, you can take the missiles we've got. We're not bothered. You can take them back if you want. So he goes on TV and he reveals the existence of the missiles. He announces a quarantine. This causes panic in American cities, especially on the East Coast, with people packing up and buying dog tags to wrap around the kids' necks so they can now be identified, and heading for the hills and all that. U Thant, who was the acting Secretary General, said the quarantine amounted to a declaration of war. The British also declared that the quarantine was illegal and refused to allow any British ships to be stopped or boarded or anything. At this point, on Monday, October 22nd, the Soviet freighters, which were bearing military supplies and nuclear warheads, are diverted by Khrushchev. Other ships that are not carrying such things carry on the course. And then the Americans decide to pick 4 ships to board and show US resolve. Meantime, there is some diplomacy going on through back channels. 2 secret approaches are made to a Soviet journalist and known intelligence agent, Georgy Bolshakov. The person chose to do this is Charles Bartlett. Now, Charles Bartlett was a friend of the family. He'd actually introduced Jackie to Jack Kennedy. And I think he introduced Bobby's wife to him originally. And he was, part and parcel. He was a good family friend. He was also a journalist. And so he has a meeting with Bolshakov. At first, Bolshakov, he doesn't know anything about what's going on, and he just doesn't believe it. So Bartlett goes back to the White House and then comes back again, and he's actually got hold of the photos that are marked for president's eyes only, and that convinces Bolshakov. Then at the same time, another journalist, Frank Holman, goes. I think that he was talking from Bobby Kennedy, Jack's brother, and he comes up with an idea that they would do a deal on the Turkish missiles to get the Cuban ones off. And at the same time, secret negotiations with the UN begin, and the Americans try to persuade the Irish to propose the Turkish missile swap and a nuclear disarmament conference. So while they're talking publicly about taking a tough stance, they're actually secretly trying to negotiate. The trouble with this negotiation, though, is that Bolshakov is a bit out of favor in the USSR. So they're not actually taking much notice of what he's saying. Khrushchev has decided that he wants everything to be public. So although the Kennedys are making approaches, they're not going anywhere at this point. Then on Wednesday the 24th, what's called DEFCON 2 was inaugurated, which is the highest state of alert before an actual declaration of war. Now, when this is made, they actually broadcast the instructions uncoded so the Russians can pick them up deliberately, so they know what's happening. The quarantine line meantime, there's a delay of 36 hours. This allows the young Alexandrov, which is carrying most of the nuclear warheads, to dock in Cuba. The quarantine line is then moved 500 miles from Cuba. Now, if you remember what it said, that was to give Khrushchev time. That was Kennedy's doing. Actually, it was under pressure from the UK and other European allies. And it was finally established 2 p.m. So it's quite a time after he actually announced it. And as I said before, the Soviet missiles carrying ships were diverted when they were around 750 miles from the quarantine line. So the eyeball to eyeball thing is a bit of an exaggeration. Mm-hmm. And then Khrushchev sends a personal letter to Kennedy offering to remove the missiles for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. Then we get the next day. There's an increasing tension. Soviet intelligence think there's an invasion is imminent. There's attempted sabotage of a Cuban mine, which was carried out by CIA-sponsored exiles. And the idea was they planted a bomb which was due to go off the next day when the miners were actually underground, but it was discovered. The Soviet freighter, the Bucharest, is allowed through the quarantine. Now, there's conflicting stories about this, but the Bucharest was apparently, or claimed to be, carrying heating oil. The Americans sort of intercepted it, and it just refused to stop and just carried on through. And the Americans radioed back saying, should they fire on it? And they were told from McNamara, no, we're not going to fire on any ships. Don't fire on anything. So so much for a quarantine, really. Then Kennedy authorizes nuclear weapons to be loaded onto aircraft. And the aircraft, these were the ones with the duty of carrying out the first air strikes on the Soviet Union in the event of war. So things are sort of heating up a bit. Then, next day, Soviet chartered Lebanese freighter is chosen to be boarded for a show of resolve. They don't find anything on this. They just find tractor parts and things like that, and it's allowed to carry on. US officials start making hints at further action, and the Brazilian president contacts Castro and tells him he's got intelligence that there's going to be bombing raids on the missile sites. At this point, the commander of the Soviet forces on Cuba readies his troops. He thinks there's an invasion or bombing or something's going to happen, and so he gets ready the battlefield nuclear weapons he's got. Now, these battlefield nuclear weapons are small compared to the big ones, but that's all relative. They're quite powerful things. They're like half a Hiroshima bomb, each one of them. And the other thing is the Americans have got no idea they've got these weapons. So, you know, the air defense radars, which had been turned off, were activated because Castro was insistent that they needed to know. And the commanders of the air defense were authorized to fire on any enemy planes. Up to this point, they've been told everyone stay cool, you know. And then on that day, for some unknown reason, Curtis LeMay, the head of the Strategic Air Command, authorizes a nuclear missile test, which seems a bit bizarre in the middle of a crisis. Luckily, the Soviet radar or air defense didn't actually pick it up. But what happened at the same time is that NASA did another test on a rocket in Florida, which actually set off the American air defense. And until it was realized, oh, right, no, it's one of ours, sort of thing. And then the B-52s are on airborne alert, which means that they're actually flying with nuclear weapons on board and ready to use. At this point, Kennedy and Khrushchev begin to realize that things are getting out of hand here. They think they're doing this sort of diplomacy and maneuvering, but something could happen and nuclear war could break out at any point, accidentally. Then we come to the next day, which is called Black Saturday. Right, Khrushchev goes on the radio. He said publicly that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey and promises not to invade. He's done this because he's fed up of, there seems to be no reaction to his letters. And as I said before, the back channels that the Kennedys are using are going nowhere. XCOM are then informed that there's 5 SS4 sites, which is the name of the missile sites, were operational and the 6 would be ready within 24 hours. Then, weirdly, Kennedy learns that he's still not told the Soviets where the quarantine line was located, and Soviet ships were heading for it. They didn't know where it was, so. Then a U-2 pilot flying a routine mission over the North Pole strays into the Soviet airspace by more than 300 miles. I mean, the original story was that he got disorientated and just strayed a little bit into their airspace. It was actually 300 miles in. Soviet Air Force scrambled to intercept it. The US Air Force scrambled 2 fighters to intercept the Soviet, and because of the high state of alert, the American fighters are only equipped with nuclear tipped missiles. Luckily, common sense prevails, and they realise it's all a mistake. And later that day, a U-2 pilot is shot down and killed by a Soviet SAM missile. Again, Kennedy had already said that if any American planes are shot down, they would invade. But he decided to hold back because he realized the decision was made by Soviet generals in Cuba and was against actually what Khrushchev was ordering at the time. So next one, still Black Saturday. The US destroyers are enforcing a quarantine around Cuba. They decide that they're going to drop depth charges on Soviet submarines to warn them to surface and be identified. Now, the thing is about this is that the Soviet submarines didn't know this. The Americans had told the Russians basically what they were going to do. We're going to drop depth charges, and when your submarine's here, one they should surface and be identified. And the Russians just ignored it because they thought, why should we? What's you know? So the submarine commanders have got no idea that the Americans are doing this, and they think that they're under attack. And they've got nuclear torpedoes on board, which the Americans didn't know about. So they've got these explosives, that's the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb. And one submarine in particular, the B-59, actually readies its nuclear torpedo. It's ready to be launched. But luckily, it needs more than at least three people on board have to agree. And second Captain Vasily Arkhipov actually persuades the captain of the submarine not to fire. So they actually surface to find out what's going on, and they come up and they're surrounded by lots of ships with floodlights and everything. They still don't know. The Americans are trying to communicate with them, but the Americans have neglected to bring a Russian speaker with them. So they're still wondering what to do next. They're surrounded by destroyers and helicopters overhead, etc. And in the end, one of the American captains decide to get the ship's jazz band to go up on deck and play Yankee Doodle Dandy and order the sailors to start dancing. This sort of convinces the Russians that they're not at war, because finally convinces them. XCOM then decide to ignore Khrushchev's Turkey offer, and they decide to ignore it and just go for the non-invasion request. This is later dubbed the Trollope ploy, which I didn't know about, but apparently Trollope has these books that young ladies deliberately misinterpret the advances of men. An official letter is hand-delivered by Bobby Kennedy to the Russian ambassador, with the agreement stating that they agree not to invade Cuba. But at the same time, he's also given a secret message from, that should be JFK, not JKK, offering to withdraw the Turkish missiles within 6 months of the Cuban missiles being withdrawn. But again, that is secret. XCOM don't know about it. The only people who know about it are the Kennedys at this point. So then the next day, Khrushchev goes on radio and announces that he has agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. So the American media call it a humiliating defeat for the Soviets. Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy to formalize the Turkish deal, but Bobby Kennedy refuses to even accept it because he doesn't want anything down on paper about this Turkish deal. Castro, on the other hand, is angered by the whole thing because he's been left out of all these whatever negotiations were going on. Nobody actually consulted the Cubans on any of this, and he refuses to talk to Khrushchev when Khrushchev tries to get in touch to explain. And then there's mass protests in Cuba against the Soviet withdrawal. So the aftermath of it. Khrushchev initially was not going to withdraw all the weapons. He reckoned that the Americans don't know how many nuclear missiles are on Cuba. They've got no idea that they've got the battlefield nuclear weapons. So he reckons he could withdraw a few, and then, as he planned, later in the year, he would then announce that there's still these missiles on Cuba, and the Americans should negotiate. In the end, the Russians decide to withdraw all the missiles because if they left them there, they would be under Cuban control. And they couldn't, unlike their Soviet bloc allies who were more or less under Soviet Union control, they couldn't dictate terms to Castro. He was just not that sort of guy. He wanted to keep them, and but he wouldn't let the Russians have any control over them. And basically, he might have been willing to use them. You never know. So the Russians decided that they couldn't chance it. So they said they've discovered that it's against Soviet law to leave the missiles. It was just an excuse. Then it was revealed that American nuclear bombers were ready to take off from UK airfields without the knowledge of the UK government. And that caused a big stink in Parliament. The Jupiter missiles were then removed from Turkey and Italy very quietly, and it was nothing to do with the Cuba thing at all. The Moscow-Washington hotline was set up. As you can see there, there's President Merkin Mutley from Dr. Strangelove on the hotline. It turns out that a lot of things in Dr. Strangelove are actually true. A lot of what they said in Dr. Strangelove was actually correct. The next thing is Khrushchev was forced to step down about a couple of years later, because the Soviets, Presidium, the Communist Party, were just, they thought he'd made a mess of the whole thing, and he was forced to retire. And then finally, in the US and the USSR and the UK signed a treaty banning atmospheric and underwater nuclear testing, which is one of the things that Khrushchev actually wanted, because he was fearful that other countries could actually start getting nuclear weapons, and it didn't affect the USSR because they did all their testing underground. So that's why it's worded that way. Then we come to, how did we get to the myth of the Soviet missile, the myth of the Kennedys and the crisis. Well, this was in the Saturday Evening Post about 6 weeks after the end of the crisis. And this said it was going to an exclusive account, the true story of the crisis. This is where we first hear about the trollop ploy. The story goes that the ex-com were all for bombing Cuba or invading Cuba, and they were shocked by they didn't want to give up the Turkish missiles, etc. And Bobby Kennedy came up with this idea of just ignoring the second letter or proposal about the Turkish missiles, and this is where it's dubbed the trollop ploy. This was written mainly by Charles Bartlett, who is, as said earlier, a good friend of the family. It was actually commissioned by the Kennedys, and before it was published, it was edited by JFK. So in a lot of ways, it's the Kennedys' own version of what happened to portray them as the great diplomats, etc. In fact, most of it is complete hogwash. It's for example, the trollop ploy is attributed to Bobby Kennedy, but on the tapes, when they're later released, you can hear Bobby Kennedy advocating invasion and bombing, not the other way around. He only swung round at the last minute. And the other thing it does is it shows Adlai Stevenson as a terrible appeaser. He wanted to swap the missiles even after the quarantine was established, and in fact he suggested the missile swap long before anything got tense, and one of the things about Adlai Stevenson is that he actually ran against Kennedy for the nomination to be president from the Democrats, and they didn't get on with each other at all. So he was sort of thrown to the wolves a bit. So finally, it's like, who won? Because that's the thing that I've seen in lots of different accounts. Who won the missile crisis? the popular account at first was that the Kennedys won, the Americans won, and then later historians are saying, well, really the Soviets won because they got a lot of what they wanted. Generally agree that Castro didn't win, but the thing is that he outlived them all, and Cuba is still there, a thorn still considered a thorn in the United States side. So it's hard to say, and it's a weird thing to say who won, because we all could have lost, because it would have just taken one mistake to set off a series of events that would have meant that the entire Northern Hemisphere would have been under a cloud, a nuclear cloud. So basically, what happened was that we were very, very lucky to still be alive after October 1962. So I don't think anybody won, except the rest of the world, because it actually managed to keep on living. So that's the Cuban Missile Crisis.